Hi, so it's Adam again, the Quality Improvement Practitioner here at ESHT, and this is sort of an extra video to address basic QI skills, the model for improvement and the PDSA cycle, but in particular, how that applies to educational requirements for people who are carrying out QIP projects, so small projects as part of their training. And those requirements have changed recently, and it seems to be creating a fair amount of confusion. And this was something that I was looking at quite a bit in education with my colleague here, Tawassel, who is a leadership fellow. So what would have been your sort of interpretation of the challenge here? With
one of the things that we identified was that often projects are sort of quite small, don't follow a specific QI methodology, and look more like audits, and don't tend to result in interventions that are either sort of sustainable or really improve the quality of care for our patients. I think one of the reasons why this often happens is that when people think about QI, often they think about audit, just because it's something that follows a sort of stepwise fashion, and it's sort of quite easy to understand and follow, even if you don't know anything about QI. Whereas QI is trying to address the same sort of problem, but going about it in a slightly different way, which is a bit more abstract. It isn't as prescriptive as audit, and isn't quite as easy to follow. So I think one of the problems that is that people do think more about the audit process than the QI process and the concept of continuous improvement. Why I think this sometimes happens is just the way that sort of junior doctors and trainee doctors, so job plans are designed, is they're often in a clinical area for a period of time, usually for 4 to 6 months. And therefore it can be harder to carry out a QI project in those areas that is sort of slightly longer term, is thinking about the problem in a deeper way, and with sort of really big and bold solutions when you're only there for a limited period of time. I think what we've thought about is, in terms of people's educational requirements and having sort of looked at those, we think that there is a place to encourage people to, rather than do sort of smaller projects, is to try and get involved in bigger projects within the clinical areas, learn all the skills they need in terms of QI, and be part of something that results in better outcomes for patients and is more aligned to the Trust's QI objectives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think I would concur with all of that stuff, in the sense that there's a real challenge, isn't there, that people are being asked potentially, or they feel that they need to deliver their own project, their own discrete project from start to finish, and at the same time they're moving between rotations. And this model for improvement methodology that you would have to apply, which is the framework we use here at ESHT, suggests that you should be carrying out cycles of change. So doing multiple cycles is going to be quite difficult if you've got a limited period of time. What I would also suggest to people is that there are benefits to using a QI approach rather than an audit approach, because quality improvement can be a little bit more flexible. So you could use smaller sample sizes and your own measurement approach. So it could potentially be easier, but I think part of the challenge is that this has recently been changed and people are struggling to understand it, being used to the sort of audit approach to things. It does say here within this guidance that only where appropriate you should be using the framework for quality improvement, which would be model for improvement. But it may be that you want to conduct, it may be that it's best to conduct an audit, or it may be that there's an ongoing piece of work.
I think, yeah, one of the things I wanted to just say is, I think even if sort of junior doctors or trainees identify a problem that they themselves want to independently sort of look at and think about, I think there is sort of space for people to still do that, and but still align that to an ongoing project. So, for example, if you want to look at early discharges or something like that, you can still sort of think about that, but just see whether there are any other projects looking at that specific problem or around that sort of wider problem, and rather than that being a whole QI project in itself, you could sort of design it in a way where it's just one PDSA cycle for another project that's already
Yeah,
ongoing.
yeah, absolutely. And quite a few people come to me with similar interests. There's lots of people who want to work on frailty related projects, and there's already pieces of work going on. So you could maybe align with something that's already happening. Yeah, I think as Tawassul's saying, it would be great if people are looking for pieces of work they can do that are aligned with something that's significant and strategic. And if you can come away from that with an understanding of how to use QI methods as well. So hopefully that's what I'll be able to get across in the next few slides.
So the requirement is to carry out a QI project within the framework of the organization. At ESHT, we use the model for improvement, where we want you to have a defined aim, either in a target population or for a particular problem where there is available data or data that you continuously record to show improvement, and where you have multiple changes that you hypothesize will lead to improvement, using a PDSA cycle and retesting different ideas to see which ones lead to improvement.
So I think that what causes some of the confusion is that people conflate quality improvement with other types of change management approach. So particularly with QIPs, this would be clinical audit, where you've got a predefined standard that we should be achieving and set numbers of patients that you should be auditing, and then you make some changes and re-audit once. Similarly, the research approach, where you have a hypothesis which you're going to test under scientific conditions and prove that you've got evidence that something's true before changing practice, is also different from quality improvement, but sometimes gets confused with it. And some of the proposals that are called QI in this organisation look more like project management, where people have a single change that they want to achieve and are making a plan of how to get there. So in quality improvement, the key difference is that we don't have just one change that we want to implement. We've got a problem that we defined and a number of different potential changes that we're going to test out on a small scale in time series and see which are impactful and helpful.
Coming back to PDSA, you plan what changes you're going to implement and multiple changes. Implement those and record what you did and study what the outcomes were, whether it led to improvement or worsening of outcomes, and decide which ones to act, which ones needed some adjustment and sort of repeating your PDSA cycle, and which ones just to abandon because it led to worsening of outcomes. It's best to think small when testing your ideas, so either in a small clinical area or with a small number of patients, so that you can sort of learn from what you've done on a small scale, and therefore that doesn't result in unintended consequences by making big changes that don't lead to improvement. And hopefully with your PDSA cycles, these small changes that you make can lead to an aggregate improvement and result in big changes. Often what people do is identify a problem and develop some sort of audit process where they look at the patient notes and think of an intervention, which sometimes is making a poster or delivering a small teaching session and re-auditing to see if it made a difference. When that happens, people often move to other organizations and there's no inherent learning or sustained improvement in our outcomes for patients.
So what I want to suggest is how you could deliver a QIP which follows more of a model for improvement approach. So you'd start by defining an improvement that you believe you could achieve, such as a percentage improvement in documenting a problem, and then you could audit that on a small scale over a period of time, hopefully getting a few data points in time. That's your baseline. And then your first test would be that change, such as amended paperwork, but then you might try a different version after looking at what happened with the data, maybe improving it and making it more impactful. And then you might move on to testing something different. So you could try your presentation or your teaching session, and then again continue to monitor and adjust the presentation, make it more interesting, engaging, perhaps go on to record it digitally so that we've got something that we can look at sustainably in the future, and then continue on from there to test different things over time.
if you look at the 4 boxes here, these are some of the strategic priorities, and there are major pieces of work going on in all of these areas, and they actually align quite well with some of the requirements from the medical education QI syllabus, which are concerned with things like virtual working and sustainability and innovation. So if we look at those requirements, you could consider something like implementing new patterns of working. We're doing all sorts of work around virtualization and remote working, which would align quite well with improving the health of our communities by making things more accessible, or making things more sustainable by reducing the amount of travel and use of resources. You could look at using new technologies to collaborate and empower people. So, for example, by using some of the digital platforms that we have within the trust, you could share information with people in a more effective way in order to collaborate, in order to be aware of problems and fix problems. You could also consider something like new philosophies to improve the health of communities and make things more sustainable, say for instance by looking at a population health approach, or putting in place some prevention activity in the area that you're working in. So there are things that you can improve in all of these areas, but it is just a question of asking a few people so that you can align yourself with a piece of work and testing out a few small things in that area that you can improve upon.
Okay, so I hope you found that useful, and it has somewhat clarified the sorts of things that you might want to be thinking about in these QIP projects. As ever, I'm available to support with pieces of work, and you can contact me at the usual email address at esh.improvement, and I'm sure that Tuwas also will be happy to talk to people from an educational point of view.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to people about any sort of current or future projects that people are thinking about.
Great. So yeah, as I say, there's lots of sources of support out there, and hopefully we'll start to see some projects that are really impactful, and you've got a better understanding of this now.